presented for the libraries before, and it was very much loved and still talked about. And this is a nice tie-in for the libraries this summer. Our theme for summer reading program is Oceans of Possibilities. So the video that Bill is shooting of Bob's presentation tonight is going to be available through the library website and through Grand Mesa Arts and Event Center's YouTube page, and so people will be able to watch it, and we can tie it in with summer reading beautifully, since it's obviously about the ocean. And I just want to put in that at Cedar Edge Library, we are now open more days. So we're now open Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, 10 to 6, and Saturdays, 10 to 4. And so if you usually go to a library up in the North Fork that isn't open as many days, you can always come to Cedar Edge or Delta if you need to get library stuff done in person. Anyway, thanks everyone for coming out, and thank you, Bob. I'll leave it to you.
Thank you, Mary Ann, and thank Voices of the Western Slope for having me tonight. And thank you all for coming out on this somewhat chilly evening. Let me ask, I know some of you have spent some time on coral reefs diving or snorkeling. How many of you are there who have floated over a coral reef? Oh, great. So you will appreciate how lovely these places are. And let me transport you, at least for a little while, to a warmer clime, even if it's just in pictures. I started out as a graduate student in geology, classical geology, but with an interest in limestones, because I had been told by an advisor in college that half the world's oil comes out of limestones, and I could get a job with an oil company. So that was my initial goal going through graduate school, looking at limestones. And in order to understand better ancient limestones, I thought it would be a good idea to go to where they're forming today to make comparisons between the recent and the ancient. So I headed off to places like South Florida and the Bahamas with some of my fellow graduate students, and we started making comparisons of places where limestones form today and ancient limestones. So limestones are calcium carbonate. So you'll hear me refer to these sediments as carbonate sediments. And coral reefs make carbonate sediments, and they also happen to make great oil reservoirs. But that's not why we appreciate coral reefs today. We now know that coral reefs protect the islands or lands just landward from them from big waves and floods during tsunamis and hurricanes. They provide fish and protein to local populations on islands in the Pacific and other places. They support fantastic tourist industries in Florida and the Bahamas, places where there are populations. But also there are these incredible places where 1% of the ocean is covered with coral reefs. And that is home to more than 25% of all the living creatures in the oceans. They're still counting the number of species in the world, but right now it looks like there are more species on coral reefs than there are in rainforests. So there's plenty of reasons to worry about coral reefs. I started this as a young man. Now I'm an old man. What can I say? But along the way, I was able to see lots of changes in coral reefs. And what I'd like to do tonight is try and show you some of these same changes. We're going to be looking at sort of three things. One is Coral Reefs 101. I'll give you a primer on what coral reefs are. And then we'll look a little bit at the history of man and men's relationships to coral reefs. And finally, we'll look at the changes I've seen over the course of my career. Instead of going to work for an oil company, I wound up going to work for the Department of Interior for the U.S. Geological Survey, and I spent 35 years looking at changes in coral reefs. Well, today we're seeing headlines like this. Marianne and I had a little discussion about what does coral reefs have to do with Voices of the Western Slope? It's a little bit of a stretch. Well, actually it's not. We're here in this drought today, and by counting tree rings in the news lately, there's been articles like this, that this looks like the worst drought in the last 1,200 years. Well, the global changes that are causing that are the same changes that are causing, the same processes that are causing changes on coral reefs. And so that's what we'll spend a little time looking at. And we have the same thing going on right here at home. And we see news articles like this. This was from December. They were already predicting that the Great Barrier Reef would have a really bad year for what's called coral bleaching because of high water temperatures. And in fact, that's going on right now, and we'll look at that a little bit toward the end of the talk. Well, most people know coral reefs from maybe the movies like Little Mermaid or Where's Nemo? Or children's books or coffee table books that are full of these beautiful color pictures. And coral reefs are beautiful and colorful, but it's actually not the corals that gives them most of their color. It's other things like sponges and sea anemones and fish, of course, the colorful fish. But corals themselves tend to be rather brown or green or maybe yellow. And here's a typical color for a Caribbean coral. And coral reefs in history have had a rather negative connotation by most people because all through from the times of the Egyptians to right up through the 1800s, ships ran aground on them. And they lost people, lost cargo. Lloyd's of London lost lots of money. So this became particularly bad along the east coast of the United States off of Florida during the 17 and 1800s. And finally it got so bad that Congress decided they had to do something about it. So what Congress did was they hired this fellow. This is Louis Agassiz. He was the foremost American scientist of his time, teaching at Harvard, and he was a coral reef guy. And they instructed him and paid him to do a study of Florida coral reefs in order to figure out how they could kill the reefs, get rid of them. And he went to Florida for 2 years and studied the coral reefs, and he came back and wrote a report to Congress. And that report phrased what they asked him to do, which was to study the growth of coral reefs to see if the growth can be prevented, and so they wouldn't have these horrible shipwrecks. And they were losing literally hundreds of ships a year on reefs in the Caribbean and Florida. Well, his answer was back to Congress that he didn't see any possibility that there was a way to stop the growth of corals beyond the natural processes that sort of slowed them down. But they grew like gangbusters. And so his solution was, you better build lighthouses on them. And that started by 1858, what was then the Lighthouse Service, which eventually became the Coast Guard, started building lighthouses on all the reefs in Florida. This is Sands Key Reef off of Key West, and Sands Key Lighthouse. It's 120 feet high, and we're looking in this aerial photograph down on the reef, and it shows the typical structure of coral reefs all around the world. The deep Atlantic Ocean is toward the bottom of the slide. The corals are living in these dark areas these stripes that are called spurs. Between the stripes are light areas of sand and coral rubble called grooves. That spur and groove structure is everywhere in coral reefs around the planet. And those corals are producing sediment, rubble, sand, lime, sand, and rubble, that gets washed up behind the reef in a shallow area called the reef flat. And if there's enough of it, it'll even develop into an island. So that's the typical structure of a coral reef. Corals themselves are these small animals. This is an enlargement of the top of the coral. And they are colonial organisms, meaning there are hundreds to thousands of them in any coral structure. The individuals are these little round, like anemone things called polyps. And they live in a little socket in their skeleton called a calyx. And they're sort of bipolar. They, Dr. Heck, what's that? Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kinds of thing. They're animals during the night, but they're plants during the day. And the way they do that is, here's the one of these polyps with its tentacles extended during the night. And it will be collecting particles from the water column and acting like an animal and digesting them and secreting the waste, which is full of nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen. But also in their tissues, they farm these little green things. This type of algae has a very weird name. It's called zooxanthellae. And they farm that because the algae can absorb those nutrients and grow well with sunlight and photosynthesize and produce oxygen for the animal part of the organism. So there's this great symbiotic relationship between algae and corals that allows them to grow very robustly. It provides them with a lot of energy for growth and making their skeletons. Well, coral reefs don't grow everywhere. They like certain conditions, only 10% of the world's oceans. They like relatively shallow water. They like normal seawater, 35 parts per thousand. If it gets too salty or too brackish, they're not there. They need to have sunlight get down to them to have their photosynthesis cranking along. They like warm water, and they like really clear water. The reason the water is clear is that corals tend to grow in the deserts of the sea. They grow in places where there are almost naturally no nutrients in the water. So there's no nutrients in the water. Algae doesn't grow in the water column. The water's clear. And that symbiotic relationship allows the corals to have their own little nutrient cycle, and they do just fine in places where there are almost immeasurable quantities of nutrients. There are about a dozen types of corals that make reefs. We call them the stony corals. And they come in sort of two varieties. They come in boulder corals like this. These are brain corals for the most part. And they grow as branching corals like these. And early in the 60s, people got interested in how you measure the growth rates of these corals. Well, the branching corals are pretty easy. You measure it, tag it so you know you're coming back to the right one, come back in 6 months and measure it again. And this particular species grows 6 inches in a year, and then in the fall, it tends to split and branch, sometimes 2, sometimes 4, but on an average, 3 branches a year. And then the next year, they grow 6 inches, and that's a classic exponential growth pattern. So if you sort of do the math, you know, in about 50 years, this coral would take over the world. Well, of course, it doesn't do that. There are things that prevent the corals from reaching their full growth potential. They can't grow out into the air. There are storms that come along and break them up and turn them into rubble on the seafloor. Fish, anemones, starfish, even some worms eat corals. But even with all of that, they grow at a pretty good rate. This is my mentor. I got to put in a plug here for this guy named Gene Shin. He'll be 90 years old this year. He was born and raised in Key West, went to University of Miami, and started studying coral reefs in the 1950s. And one of these things he did to get at these growth rates is he pounded stainless steel stakes in boulder corals. And he would come back every year and see how much of the stake was still sticking out. And that way he determined that these corals were growing 1/2 inch to 1 inch a year. By the time I started working with Gene in the 70s, we had another way. We could take a diamond drill and take a core through the skeleton of a coral head. Now remember, only the very top skin of the coral is the living surface. Everything below that is dead skeletal material that they've left as they're growing. So you can pull a core out of a coral head like that and slice it on a diamond saw and x-ray it, and lo and behold, they had growth bands in them that are exactly analogous to tree rings. So this core was taken in 1986. You can go back and measure the growth rate every year for how long the core was living, and you can figure out that the core started growing sometime before 1860. Well, I'm going to be on a little theme here of how robust coral growth used to be. They produce all these sediments, which on a scale of a coral reef builds right up to sea level, and then storms start moving those sediments back of the reef and piling up. And this is the edge of an atoll in the Pacific. The open Pacific Ocean is out here. The waves are breaking on the reef crest, and the reef flat is behind the crest. And this sediment is being produced and piling up and moving all the way back into the lagoon and slowly filling up the lagoon. That's another, again, this is the classic structure of coral reefs. If you go out and look where the waves are breaking, here's our spur and groove structure again. Here, the spurs are very narrow. The corals are extremely robust, and they're growing up, and the spurs are actually enclosing the grooves and making caves down underneath. Here's the reef crest where the waves are breaking. Out at the top of the slide, it's maybe 50, 60 feet deep. And you can go exploring the grooves. And when you're swimming through these things, it's like swimming through a living cathedral. It's just beautiful. Where's Bob? Oh, there's Bob. If you look closely, you can see my tank and my fins as I nose around in the caves in the grooves. If you go further out, there's often around the Caribbean and the Bahamas and the Pacific a wall. And like dive shops will advertise, come dive the wall. It's a really exciting thing to do. And that wall is there because about 18,000 years ago, when the poles were covered with continental glaciers during the ice ages, there was so much water wrapped up in those glaciers that sea level was lowered about 400 feet. And the waves of the sea were lapping up against the base of the reef and carving cliffs in that surface. The glaciers melted, sea level came back up, and that surface is now covered with live coral, depending on the light, down to about 125 feet, maybe 150 feet. And then you get down to like 250 feet, 210 feet, and there's not enough light for living photosynthetic corals anymore. So what you have is a sand apron and non-photosynthetic organisms like sponges and sea whips and sea fans living on the sand. So that's a picture of what coral reefs look like. Well, this is Charlie Darwin. And he got on the Beagle and cruised through the Pacific in the 1850s. And he was very observant of these atolls in the Pacific, and he was very interested in how much limestone coral reefs could make. And what he saw was, he saw islands like this. This is Moorea, and volcanic islands that were surrounded by a fringing coral reef. And then he saw older islands where the island was smaller and there was a barrier reef separated from the island by a deep lagoon. This is a Bora Bora. And then the final stage he saw was this, a classic Pacific atoll, a ring of islands with no island at all in the center. And what he theorized was that the islands were sinking and coral reefs were growing fast enough to keep up with the change in sea level. So at first you had a little fringing reef, and later on the reef grew outward and upward to form a barrier reef, and then finally a classic atoll. People argued about this for 100 years. It was not finally proven until 1951. It's a really interesting concept of how much limestone coral reefs can make. But the point was, he was right, and the corals were cranking away, making all this lime sediment. When we started in the business of taking these coral cores, you could take a 4-inch diameter core out of the top of a coral head, fill that hole full of cement, and 2 years later come back and it was almost completely healed over. This is a little lecture on how strong growth corals had, at least when I started in the business. This is a interesting picture. This is a work glove. And these notches in this coral had been hit by a boat, and the propeller just carved grooves in it. When it was fresh, there would have been big white marks in the skeleton there. All of that has healed over, and in another few years, that groove too would be entirely gone. Okay, let me show you the most extreme case of the virility of corals that I know of, that I experienced. This is a nuclear bomb. I had the dubious pleasure of being under contract with the Air Force and Los Alamos Labs to do surveys of nuclear craters in the Pacific. And we went out and mapped a couple of big nuclear craters on the Inuitak Atoll in Bikini. So this is an aerial photograph of the margin of Inuitak Atoll. And what you're looking at is the open Pacific Ocean up here, the edge of the reef where the waves are breaking, here the reef crest, and the reef flat. The reef flat is really wide here. It's more than a mile. And this figure 8 thing here is where 2 nuclear devices were set off by the military. You can see the rays of sediment that were blown out of these craters, just like some of the craters on the moon. This one, which they called Oak, was a mile across and 400 feet deep. You could put all of downtown Denver in that hole. And what's interesting here is that blast knocked a chunk of the outer reef off that went sliding down into the open Pacific Ocean off the atoll. Well, they built structures, there were actually islands here to begin with, and they built structures on the island to support the nuclear blasts and get it ready and monitor as well as they could when it went off. And some of those structures still remained in the 80s when we worked there. And you could find corals growing on this debris, and using our dating techniques, we were able to show that these corals started growing within 2 years of the atomic blasts. Corals were tough. Well, by the mid-1980s, people at least appreciated the intrinsic values of coral reefs, and they were starting to make regulations to try and control some of the things that were happening to the reefs. So they were worried about things like anchor damage and coral collections and people stomping on the corals and trash being thrown from boats. And so regulations were put in place to try and stop some of the physical assaults to coral reefs in the 80s. But at the same time, some other things were happening that scientists began to notice. Going back to my friend Gene, he had started photographing corals in the 1950s, and we went back about every decade and took a picture of the same place. So here's this wonderful boulder coral, huge. It's probably been growing there for 300 years. And by 1988, it was showing signs of, you might call it senility. There was erosion on the sides and holes being formed in the coral. And there were beginning to be other kinds of organisms that were growing on the surface of the coral. And by 1998, that entire coral head had died after 300 years. And there was nothing but algae and some sea whips and sea fans, other non-reef building organisms growing on the surface of that coral.
Where is that coral?
Where is it? Key Largo, off of Key Largo. All of these are off of Key Largo. Here's another spot. This is the place where Gene hammered these stainless steel pins in the coral heads. Didn't seem to bother the corals at all as of 1971. They were still doing great. In fact, that group of boulder corals was surrounded by a really healthy group of branching corals. But by 1986, the tops of the corals had started to die. The branching corals had died back. And by 1998, there was only a few little spots of living boulder coral on the surface, and basically the whole little group of corals had died. So scientists were out monitoring this, and the best way they decided to monitor corals was to measure what was considered the gold standard of coral reefs, which is how much the bottom is covered with living, hard, stony corals. Just an aerial measurement. This is a plot from Carysfort Reef, which is off Key Largo. And in the 1970s, 60% of the reef was covered with live coral. By the 1980s, it was starting to die. And by the 1990s, that reef had collapsed to less than 5% coral cover. And Linda asked me, well, what happened after that? And the answer was, well, there's nothing left to measure. That's the way it went. And that was happening all through Florida and actually all through the Caribbean during that time period. So you started seeing newspaper articles like this. This was 1991. Washington Post, Florida barrier reef seemed doomed by 2000. Well, 2000 there was still some coral there, but that's pretty much gone now too. The dive shops hated this. They did not want to see articles like this. Very interesting backlash developed. And what was killing the reefs was something scientists, reef observers had not seen before. It was a series of, they called them coral diseases because they didn't know what else to call them. So here is a elkhorn coral. The living tissue is this nice brown color. This white band is dead coral skeleton with no living tissue on it. And if it sits in seawater long enough, it starts getting sort of greenish as it gets coated with algae. Well, that infection moves right up the branches, and within, a summer, it will kill the entire coral colony. Here's another variety. They call this one black band disease. It tended to attack boulder corals. This black band, which is a combination of algae and bacteria and some viruses and other things, started evidently over on this side of the coral, and it's moving across the coral, eating the tissues as it goes, and just leaving behind bare dead coral skeleton. And this was occurring all over, because I had a friend who spent the summer with an underwater vacuum cleaner trying to suck off these black bands to see if he could prevent this from progressing. It didn't work. And the creative names for some of these diseases. This was called pink ooze, which was a pink sort of slime that was doing the same thing. People are still studying these diseases. They don't know exactly why they showed up. It probably has to do with changes in nutrients due to pollution on the reefs. But this took a terrible toll on coral reefs in the Atlantic in the 80s and 90s. Finally, in places where there's definitely a lot of pollution, meaning nutrients getting into these otherwise nutrient-free environments, instead of the corals being able to handle those extra nutrients, they've got their own nutrient thing going. So what would happen would be other organisms would move in to take advantage of the new nutrients in the water column, particularly sponges and algae. These red things are sponges. This is a sort of asparagus-like algae. If this were a video, you would see it waving back and forth in the currents. And entire coral reefs were taken over by algae in areas where there were excess nutrients getting into the water column. So scenes like this of beautiful sort of forests, branching corals, were turning into scenes like this, dead coral sticks on the bottom, covered with some marine growth. Or in some of the more beautiful reefs where you had, this is called the elkhorn coral. These branches are 4 or 5 feet long. They would get these diseases and die in place. So in a year or two, you just have a forest of dead coral standing there. And when the next hurricane came through, it would knock it down just to reef rubble. At the same time, we were starting to see something else, which was weird. Some of the corals were just turning white, but they still had living coral tissue on their surfaces. The coral had been stressed, and it threw out its symbiotic algae. It's that symbiotic algae that gives the coral its color. So when that's removed, the little corallites are clear. You see right through it to the coral skeleton. They can survive this way for 6 weeks up to maybe 3 months. But if the stress continues beyond that, they'll die. If the water cools off early enough, they can reacquire that algae and regain their color. But this was getting worse and worse. It was sort of interesting. We'd go to international meetings and talk about this happening in the Atlantic. And the guys from the Great Barrier Reef would say, oh, we don't have that problem. That's an Atlantic problem. Well, a decade later, guess what? They started doing this. So this is on the Great Barrier Reef. First they were seeing patches of coral bleaching. And now right now, January, that prediction they made in December about bad coral bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef in January is happening. Acres and acres of live corals are bleaching at this very moment. Well, what's going on? Well, what's going on is the oceans are getting warmer, and bleaching is a reaction, a stress reaction to temperatures too high for corals. And you may know that the Earth is getting warmer. Well, 93% of that heat is going into the oceans. So in places, shallow water, places corals like to grow, they're getting hotter and hotter during the summer. So like right now, it's our winter, but it's the Australian summer, and the Great Barrier Reef is bleaching. So here last month, you see a headline like this. Now, worldwide, there's really no safe haven for coral reefs. This bleaching is going on just about everywhere there are coral reefs. You may have seen this graph before. This is a rather famous graph in atmospheric science. It's the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over the last 50 years. And it's been zooming up. And it's been doing a couple of things. One is, most people think that's what's responsible for the atmospheric warming. And two, that carbon dioxide is being absorbed into the oceans and making them more acidic. They can actually measure the pH and see the change in the pH in the oceans over the last 20 years. So now, in addition to coral bleaching, we're beginning to dissolve away those lime sediments. You know, you take a piece of anything, limestone or cement, you put a little acid on it and it fizzes. Well, that's what's happening in the world's oceans right now. There's enough lime carbonate sediment lying in the shallow water that that's probably where most of the active dissolution is going on right now. But at the same time, it's making it harder. The corals have to provide more energy to make their own skeletons as they're trying to precipitate calcium carbonate against this more acidic ocean. So the threats we worry about to coral reefs today have changed. They're not so much physical threats as global threats. You know, pollution and coral diseases, the oceans are getting hotter, and the oceans are getting more acidic, which actually not only corals, but clams, some sponges, all kinds of marine organisms that make calcium carbonate skeletons are being affected by that. Well, see headlines like this now. What's interesting is that a lot of these corals, when they bleach, before they go totally white, they change color a little bit. So some places get really colorful just before they get wiped out. Very sad. Well, it appears that we're doing now what Louis Agassiz thought was impossible. We are actually wiping out major portions of the coral reefs of the world. And I don't really want to leave you on this really pessimistic note. So there are folks trying to do something about it. And what they're doing are they're creating coral nurseries. And they take little sticks, in this case there's sticks of branching corals, and they're hanging them in the water column so they're not down in the sediment. And they're growing them for 2 or 3 years, and then they're taking them out and they're gluing them onto the surface of old dead reefs. Very time consuming, but very interesting work. Here's another nursery where they're doing a couple of different species of branching corals, and they're also doing boulder corals on these little sets. They look like the kinds of sets you might buy, I don't know, onion sets to put in your garden or something. And they take them out And one at a time, they glue them to the surface of what's dead rock on the reef or former coral reef skeleton. Well, we can hope that this works. Life springs eternal. There are lots of young people in the world who can go out and do this. And it's sort of interesting work. So we keep our fingers crossed and hope it works. And I'm here to not only give this talk, but to plug the library. The library in my life was just a wonderful place. It opened the world to me. And I want to donate 3 really obscure books to the library that nobody would ever read unless they were a coral reef nerd. But I think this will be interesting reading for some of you if you want to take one of these out. One is a biography of Louis Agassiz and the sort of interesting times he lived as a scientist in the mid-1800s when science was not really a thing yet. The second volume is called Reef Madness, and it goes through the fights between scientists over what coral reefs were and what they represented and how much limestone they could actually make. And it documents it. They sent out in the 1800s and early 1900s, they sent out very expensive large expeditions to the Pacific atolls to try and figure this kind of stuff out. And finally, The Reef by Ian McCallum. He's an Australian, and he talks about man's relationship to the Great Barrier Reef, and then his experience over the last, he's a guy my age, his experiences over the last 50 years watching the Great Barrier Reef change. They're all good reads. Well, let me finish there with a thank you. And let me tell you one more story to leave things on more of an optimistic note. I taught my children, my 2 daughters, to dive. And a few years ago, my 10-year-old grandson learned to dive. He went down to the Yucatan Peninsula. They went out on a dive boat to dive on the reef, and the dive master took him down. And what he showed him was this, which is soft corals, fish, but there are no stony corals there. This white stuff is all old, dead reef. The water was clear, the water was warm. There were some beautiful tropical fish swimming around. My grandson came back from this and said, wow! It's like the greatest thing he'd ever done. So he has a completely different concept of coral reefs than I do. And he'll carry that forward. And people will do what they can to preserve these places, just like we here on the Western Slope will try and store our water or get better irrigation systems so that we can continue to